Hi everybody. This video discusses experimental fiction, which is the kind of fiction that we're going to be reading this week. For most of this unit on fiction, we've been reading short stories that follow the basic rules, which are sometimes called the conventions of fiction. For example, the stories have followed a familiar plot pattern. There's an exposition, rising action in which the plot or the conflict sort of intensifies, a climax, which is the highest moment of tension, a falling action, where that tension begins to de-escalate, and then the denouement, which is where the tension gets released and everything is resolved. Some of the stories also, most of the stories that we've been reading have familiar settings. So they're set in realistic places. They're not set in imaginary worlds or on planets or in the future or in alternate universes. They're set in places and times that feel true to our own experiences as people. They have fairly realistic characters, so they tend to represent people who are similar to us, that have recognizable psychological makeups. So, even if you don't necessarily agree with Sunny's choices in Sunny's Blues, he seems like he could be a real person. And then finally, the stories often feature characters that develop or change in some kind of way. Characters often sort of figure out something about themselves or figure out something about the world, or their feelings towards something or someone changes in some kind of way. So these are all stories that to some extent follow sort of the rules of fiction. They sort of fulfill the basic expectations that we have for what a story should look like and how a story should be structured. This week, we're going to be reading stories that break some of these rules in one or more ways. Both of the stories that are assigned for this week do not follow a familiar plot pattern, so they don't necessarily follow that structure I just described. And at least one of these stories has characters that are intentionally sort of flat or not very well developed. Even though these stories break the rules of fiction, however, they still convey ideas, or they still develop themes. In fact, they break these rules, or they break these expectations in order to call attention to the ideas that the stories convey. So as you're reading the stories for this week, I want you to pay attention to the ways in which they play with or experiment or break the expectations that you have for what stories should sound like and how stories should be structured. And so I have some questions for you to think about. The first question is about how the stories experiment with plot. So I want you to think about how the story sort of breaks or experiments with traditional plot patterns. So remembering that traditional plot pattern that we talked about is that one that starts with exposition, then rising action, then the climax, then falling action, and finally a resolution. And then, and related to that, I want you to think about what idea the story conveys. So what sort of ideas or themes is the author developing through the story? And then how does the story's experiment with plot reinforce these ideas? So how is that sort of experiment with the structure of plot tied to the ideas that the story is conveying? And then in addition to that, those questions about plot, I also want you to think about characters. So I want you to pay attention to whether the story has well-developed characters. And if it does have well-developed characters, just as with any story we've read, I want you to pay attention to how the author is revealing the character's personality and motivations. So even if though these might be non-traditional stories, the author might use traditional techniques to help us to understand and identify with characters. And if the characters are not well-developed, if they feel flat, I want you to think about whether you think this lack of development is intentional. Is this something that the author is trying to do? And why so, or why not? And then related to that, if the characters do seem to be intentionally undeveloped, what do you think that has to do with the themes that are being developed in the story? How might sort of flat characters undeveloped characters help the author reinforce or develop the themes that they're trying to develop. So these are some of the questions I want you to be thinking about as you read these stories, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about them.